A nation divided, a war that will shape the course of history, and in the middle of it all, one man, towering above the chaos, determined to hold a broken country together. His name is Abraham Lincoln. But before he was a legend, before he was a martyr, before his words were carved into the memory of a nation, he was a boy, born in a one-room log cabin, raised in the unforgiving wilderness. No wealth, no privilege, just calloused hands and a relentless hunger for something greater. He was not meant to lead, he was not meant to rule, and yet destiny had other plans. Through tragedy, through failure, through war and bloodshed, he would rise. He would challenge an empire built on chains. He would defy the odds, and in the end, he would pay the ultimate price. This is the story of America's greatest trial. This is the story of the man who faced it. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. February 12th, 1809. In the dark forests of Hardin County, Kentucky, a child enters the world. He is not born in a palace nor in a grand estate, but in a one-room log cabin, no bigger than a tool shed. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, are frontier people, hard-working, uneducated, scraping by in a world where survival is never guaranteed. They name their son Abraham. The Lincolns live on the very edge of civilization. Their cabin stands in Sinking Spring Farm, surrounded by dense woods and the distant howls of wolves. The land is tough, the winters brutal. Thomas Lincoln, a carpenter and farmer, works tirelessly to provide for his family. He is a man of strength, but not of ambition. He believes in hard labor and nothing more. His son, however, will prove to be different. Abraham's early years are marked by loss and struggle. By the time he is 7, his family is forced to move. The land they live on is taken from them due to uncertain property titles, a common issue in the untamed frontier. They pack what little they own and cross the Ohio River into Indiana, settling in the thick forests of Little Pigeon Creek. But the hardships are only beginning. In the winter of 1818, death comes to the Lincoln home. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, only 34 years old, falls ill with a mysterious sickness known as milk sickness, a fatal poisoning caused by drinking milk from cows that had grazed on the poisonous white snakeroot plant. There is no cure, no medicine, only pain and waiting. Abraham, just 9 years old, watches as his mother fades before his eyes. Her last words to him, "Be good to your father." She is buried in an unmarked grave in the wilderness. For the first time, Abraham Lincoln understands loss, but it will not be the last. His father remarries, a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Unlike Thomas, she sees something in young Abraham. Where others see just another farm boy, she sees potential. She encourages his hunger for knowledge, brings books into the home, and urges him to read. And Lincoln does. He reads anything he can find: the Bible, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare, law books, poetry. He teaches himself through the words of men long dead, devouring knowledge with an unmatched hunger. But there is no escaping the world he was born into. Lincoln's father believes in hard labor, not education. The boy is sent into the fields, swinging an axe, plowing soil, cutting logs. He grows strong, his hands calloused, his back hardened from endless work. But his mind, it is restless. It longs for more. By the time he is 19, he suffers another blow. His sister, Sarah, dies during childbirth. Once again, grief becomes his companion. Once again, he buries a loved one in the cold ground of the frontier. And once again, he presses forward. But the wilderness can no longer contain him. The axe, the plow, the endless cycle of labor. It is not enough. He dreams of something beyond the trees, beyond the farm. And soon Abraham Lincoln will leave it all behind, stepping onto a path that will change the world forever. The frontier made him strong, books made him smart, but neither could satisfy the fire burning inside Abraham Lincoln. He was a man caught between two worlds, the backbreaking labor of the frontier and the boundless possibilities of knowledge. The time had come to choose which path to follow. At 21 years old, Lincoln leaves home. His family moves to Illinois, settling in a place called New Salem. It is here that Lincoln begins to reinvent himself. No longer just a farmhand or a rail splitter, he begins exploring the world beyond physical labor. He works as a store clerk, a postmaster, even a surveyor. But he is not an ordinary worker. He spends more time reading newspapers than stacking shelves, more time telling stories and debating politics than counting change. And people notice. One thing becomes clear: Abraham Lincoln has a gift. He can capture a room with just his voice. He can make men laugh, make them think, make them believe. It is his greatest weapon, and soon it will carry him into politics. At 23 years old, Lincoln runs for the Illinois state legislature. He has no money, no connections, no formal education, just ambition and an iron will. He campaigns the only way he can, on foot, walking miles through the countryside, shaking hands, delivering speeches to anyone who will listen. He speaks about improving infrastructure, expanding education, creating opportunity for ordinary people. His message is strong, but in the end, he loses, a crushing defeat. But Lincoln is not a man to break easily. He refuses to give up. In the years that follow, he immerses himself in self-education. Law books, philosophy, government. He teaches himself everything he can about how the world works. And when he runs again in 1834, this time, he wins. At 25 years old, Abraham Lincoln is now a member of the Illinois state legislature. The boy who once split logs in the wilderness now sits among lawmakers, shaping policy. But something is missing. He knows that if he is to rise further, he must master the law. And so Lincoln does what he always does. He teaches himself. He borrows books from local attorneys, studies at night by candlelight, and practices his speeches in front of a mirror. He does not attend law school. He does not need to. He studies harder than any student. And in 1836, he passes the bar exam. Within a year, he is practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Law becomes his true battlefield. He earns a reputation as a brilliant and honest attorney. He never twists the truth to win a case, never deceives a jury. If a client is guilty, he tells them outright. His honesty earns him a name that will follow him for the rest of his life, Honest Abe. Some of his cases become legendary. In the Almanac trial, he defends a man accused of murder. The key witness claims he saw the crime under the light of the moon. Lincoln, calm and methodical, pulls out an almanac. He flips to the date of the crime and proves the moon was barely visible that night. The case is thrown out. Lincoln wins. As the years pass, he becomes one of the most respected lawyers in Illinois. He travels the circuit courts, riding hundreds of miles on horseback, defending farmers, merchants, and ordinary people. His voice carries weight. His presence commands respect. But Lincoln does not just want to practice the law, he wants to change it, and soon politics will call him back once more, this time on a national stage. By the late 1830s, Abraham Lincoln is no longer just a lawyer. He is a rising force in Illinois politics. But even as his career flourishes, his personal life is a battlefield of its own. A man who had conquered poverty, hardship, and failure now faces his greatest struggles, not in the courtroom or the legislature, but in matters of the heart and soul. Springfield, Illinois, 1839. Abraham Lincoln meets Mary Todd, a woman unlike any he has ever known. Born into wealth and privilege, Mary comes from a prominent Kentucky family. She is intelligent, fiercely ambitious, and politically astute. While others see Lincoln as a rough country lawyer, Mary sees something deeper, a man destined for greatness. Their courtship is anything but simple. Mary is pursued by other men, including Lincoln's political rival, Stephen Douglas. But Lincoln wins her heart. They become engaged. But as the wedding approaches, something shifts. Lincoln, plagued by self-doubt and depression, breaks off the engagement in 1841. The decision sends him spiraling. Friends fear for his mental state. He isolates himself, avoids social gatherings, and speaks of his life as if it is already over. But fate is not done with them. 2 years later, Mary and Lincoln reunite. And on November 4th, 1842, they marry. But their marriage is anything but easy. Lincoln, deeply absorbed in law and politics, is often distant. Mary, passionate and sharp-tongued, demands attention. They fight, they struggle, but through it all, they remain bound together. Yet happiness is fleeting. Their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, is born healthy. But in 1850, tragedy strikes. Their second son, Edward, dies of tuberculosis at just 3 years old. Lincoln is shattered, but he does what he has always done. He buries his pain beneath his work. More children come, Willie and Tad. Lincoln adores them, playing with them even in the White House years later. But more heartbreak is on the horizon. And this time, even the President of the United States will be powerless to stop it. By 1846, Lincoln's ambition takes him beyond Illinois. He wins a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He arrives in Washington, D.C., eager to make an impact. But almost immediately, he finds himself on the wrong side of history. Or so it seems. At the time, the United States is engaged in the Mexican-American War. President James K. Polk claims the war was provoked by Mexican aggression, but Lincoln does not believe it. He demands proof, challenging the president to show the exact location where American blood was supposedly spilled on American soil. He calls it an unjust war, one fought only to expand slavery into new territories. The backlash is immediate. Lincoln's opposition to the war is deeply unpopular. He is called unpatriotic, accused of dishonoring the soldiers who fought and died. His own party turns on him. When his term ends in 1849, Lincoln is politically exiled. He returns to Illinois, convinced that his political career is over. For nearly a decade, he disappears from national politics. He focuses on his law practice, building a successful career. He argues cases before the Illinois Supreme Court. He represents railroads, businesses, and ordinary citizens. He sharpens his skills in logic, persuasion, and public speaking. But while he is gone from Washington, the country is changing, and soon it will call him back to battle. 1854. The nation stands on the edge of destruction. Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that allows slavery to expand into new Western territories. The act, championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, shatters the fragile balance between free and slave states. The country erupts. Violence breaks out. Kansas becomes a battleground, drowning in blood. For Lincoln, this is the breaking point. He cannot stay silent any longer. He re-enters politics with fire in his voice. In speech after speech, he denounces slavery's expansion. He calls it a moral evil, not just a political issue, but a threat to the soul of America. And then, in 1858, the battle becomes personal. Lincoln faces Stephen Douglas in a series of debates that will become legendary. Before massive crowds, the two men clash over the future of the nation. Douglas defends popular sovereignty, the right of territories to choose slavery for themselves. Lincoln strikes back, declaring, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The words shake the country. Lincoln loses the Senate race, but something extraordinary happens. His name is now known across America. He is no longer just an Illinois lawyer. He is now a national figure. And when the next presidential election comes, the people will remember his words. The storm is building, and soon the fate of the Union will rest in Abraham Lincoln's hands. 1858. The battle over slavery is no longer confined to speeches or debates. It has turned violent. Blood runs through the streets of Kansas. Abolitionist John Brown plots uprisings against the South, and the nation is spiraling toward chaos. Abraham Lincoln, once an Illinois lawyer with a fading political career, is now a national figure. His words have struck fear in the hearts of the South and awakened a movement in the North. And soon, that movement will carry him to the highest office in the land. By 1860, America is on the verge of collapse. The question is no longer whether war will come, it is when. The issue of slavery has shattered the political system. The Democratic Party, once a powerful force, splits in two. Northern Democrats support Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats back John C. Breckinridge, a defender of slavery's expansion. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominates John Bell, hoping to keep the peace. But the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, stands firm. They are anti-slavery, pro-union, and determined to stop the spread of human bondage. And so, they turn to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is not the most radical abolitionist. He is not the most experienced politician. But he is something more, a symbol, a self-made man, a leader who speaks plainly, a voice for ordinary Americans. And most importantly, he is someone the North can rally behind without alienating moderates. The campaign is brutal. The South sees Lincoln as a tyrant, a man who will destroy their way of life. Rumors spread that he will free the slaves, arm them, and unleash rebellion across the southern states. Death threats flood in. Southern leaders warn that if Lincoln wins, the South will leave the Union. But Lincoln does not waver. He does not campaign aggressively. He does not have to. His words have already reached the people. On November 6, 1860, the results come in. Lincoln wins, but barely. He secures only 40% of the popular vote. In the South, his name was not even on the ballot in 10 states. But in the Electoral College, he dominates. The North, with its larger population, carries him to victory. Abraham Lincoln is now the 16th President of the United States. But there is no celebration in the South. There are no peaceful transitions of power. Before Lincoln can even take office, the Union begins to unravel. December 20th, 1860. South Carolina secedes from the Union. One by one, other southern states follow: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They declare Lincoln's election to be an act of war. They will not be ruled by him. They will not allow their way of life, the institution of slavery, to be threatened. They choose disunion. In February 1861, these states form their own government, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis is named their president. Their constitution is nearly identical to the US Constitution, except for one crucial difference. It explicitly protects slavery forever. They believe they have broken free, that they will be left alone, that Lincoln will not stop them. They are wrong. Lincoln does not believe secession is legal. He does not believe the Union can simply be dissolved. In his eyes, these states are in rebellion, not a separate country. But he faces an impossible choice. If he moves too quickly, he risks war. If he does nothing, the Union may never be restored. March 4th, 1861. In Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln stands on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. Soldiers line the streets. Tension hangs in the air. He's about to take the oath of office, but half the country refuses to recognize him as president. He knows that every word he speaks today will determine the fate of the nation. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln does not call for war. He does not call for violence. Instead, he pleads for unity. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. He assures the South he has no intention of abolishing slavery where it exists, only stopping its expansion. But then, he makes one thing clear: secession is not an option. The Union is perpetual, and if war comes, it will not be by his hand. His words are measured, careful. But in Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate forces are already surrounding Fort Sumter. The moment Lincoln takes office, the countdown to war begins. The Union is breaking, the government is in crisis, and in just a few weeks, the first cannon will fire. Abraham Lincoln has been president for only a month, and he is already standing on the edge of the abyss. April 1861. The Union is hanging by a thread. 7 states have already left. Jefferson Davis leads a rebellion, defying Abraham Lincoln's authority. Washington is in a state of panic. But Lincoln refuses to act recklessly. He still believes war can be avoided, if only the South will listen. But in Charleston, South Carolina, the Confederacy is done listening. Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold sitting in the middle of Charleston Harbor. It is one of the last Union-held forts in the South. Lincoln knows that if he surrenders it, he legitimizes the Confederacy. But if he reinforces it with weapons and soldiers, he gives the South the excuse they need for war. Lincoln chooses the middle ground. He sends only food and supplies. No troops, no weapons, a peaceful resupply mission. But to the South, it does not matter. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons erupt. The first shots of the Civil War have been fired. For 34 hours, artillery pounds the fort. The Union garrison, led by Major Robert Anderson, holds out as long as they can, but they are outgunned. They surrender. The Confederacy has won its first battle. News spreads like wildfire. The North is outraged. The South is emboldened. The time for words is over. Lincoln, now faced with the reality of war, makes his move. On April 15th, he issues a call for 75,000 volunteers. The Union will fight to crush the rebellion, but his call to arms has an unintended consequence. It pushes more states into the Confederacy. Virginia, the most powerful southern state, secedes. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina follow. The Confederacy now holds 11 states, stretching from Texas to Virginia. The capital is moved to Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington. The war has begun. The Union versus the Confederacy, a nation divided. Both sides prepare for battle. The Union has industry, factories, railroads, and manpower. The Confederacy has better generals, home field advantage, and a cause they are willing to die for. The South does not believe the North has the will to fight. Lincoln is mocked, his leadership questioned. They believe the war will be over in months. Lincoln, however, is learning quickly. He must become a wartime president overnight. He must manage generals, balance politics, and control a fractured nation, all while keeping the border states from seceding. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware remain torn between North and South. If they leave, the Union is doomed. Lincoln uses every tool at his disposal, diplomacy, military force, even martial law, to keep them under Union control. And then, in July 1861, comes the first real battle of the war. The North is eager for a quick victory. Lincoln's First Army, led by General Irvin McDowell, marches toward the Confederate forces in Virginia. Their goal? Capture Richmond. End the war before it begins. But war is never that simple. On July 21st, 1861, the two armies clash at Bull Run. Northern spectators, senators, reporters, even civilians, ride out to watch, bringing picnic baskets. They expect a glorious Union victory. Instead, they witness chaos. Confederate troops, led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, hold firm. Union soldiers panic. The battlefield collapses into confusion. What begins as an organized assault ends in disaster. Union troops flee in terror back to Washington. The once mighty Union Army is humiliated. Washington is thrown into panic. The North realizes the truth. This war will not be over quickly. It will be long, bloody, and costly. Lincoln does not break. He does what he always does. He adapts. He fires McDowell, replacing him with General George McClellan. He expands the army. He tightens his control over the war effort. He begins to transform into the leader the Union desperately needs. But war is not just fought on the battlefield. It is fought in the halls of government. Lincoln is no ordinary president. He does things no president has ever done before. And for many, he goes too far. To keep the Union together, Lincoln makes controversial moves. He suspends habeas corpus, allowing the arrest of Confederate sympathizers without trial. He declares martial law in border states. He shuts down newspapers that spread Confederate propaganda. Some call it tyranny, but Lincoln sees it differently. Survival. His critics attack him. The press mocks him as weak. Political opponents call him a dictator. Even members of his own party question his leadership. But Lincoln does not back down. He believes in one thing above all else. The Union must survive, no matter the cost. Months pass. The Confederacy wins battle after battle. Lincoln cycles through generals, each one too hesitant, too reckless, or too slow. The war drags on, and the casualties rise into the thousands. The North begins to lose faith. By 1862, the pressure is unbearable. The war is costing more lives than anyone imagined, and Lincoln knows that just winning battles is not enough. He must do something bigger, something that will change the war forever. And soon he will, because Lincoln is about to make the most daring move of his presidency. Months pass. The Confederacy wins battle after battle. Lincoln cycles through generals, each one too hesitant, too reckless, or too slow. The war drags on, and the casualties rise into the thousands. The North begins to lose faith. By 1862, the pressure is unbearable. The war is costing more lives than anyone imagined, and Lincoln knows that just winning battles is not enough. He must do something bigger, something that will change the war forever. And soon he will, because Lincoln is about to make the most daring move of his presidency. By 1862, the Civil War is no longer just a rebellion. It is a bloodbath. Thousands lie dead. Battlefields are littered with bodies, and the Union's hope for a swift victory has crumbled. Abraham Lincoln watches as the war spirals beyond control. He knows the Union cannot endure this forever. Something has to change. And then, Lincoln begins to see the war for what it truly is. Not just a fight to save the Union, but a fight for freedom itself. For Lincoln, slavery has always been a moral evil. But before the war, he tolerated its existence where it already stood, believing it would die out naturally. Now, he realizes the truth. Slavery is not dying. It is fueling the Confederate war machine. Every Southern plantation, every enslaved laborer working the fields feeds the Confederacy. Cotton exports fund their weapons. Slave labor frees up white men to fight. The South is built on human bondage. And Lincoln knows, if he destroys slavery, he cripples the rebellion. But the decision is dangerous. If he moves too fast, he risks losing the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, who are still loyal to the Union but hold slaves. If they turn against him, the Union will fracture beyond repair. Lincoln needs a victory, a moment where he can strike, not just with an army, but with history itself. That moment comes on September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 men fall in just hours. The Union, led by General George McClellan, clashes with Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces along the banks of Antietam Creek in Maryland. It is chaos. Cannon fire rips through the morning mist. Soldiers charge into the smoke. Fields turn red with blood. For the first time, Lee's advance into the North is stopped. The Confederates are forced to retreat. The Union claims victory, but barely. It is not the overwhelming triumph Lincoln had hoped for, but it is enough. And Lincoln knows this is his moment. 5 days later, Lincoln gathers his cabinet. He places a document before them and declares, "I have made up my mind. It must be done." On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. With one stroke of his pen, he changes the war forever. All persons held as slaves in rebelling states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The proclamation does not immediately free all enslaved people. It applies only to the Confederacy, not the border states, not areas under Union control. But it transforms the war. It is no longer just a battle for the Union. It is now a war against slavery. The South is outraged. They see this as proof that Lincoln is their true enemy. But in the North, the proclamation electrifies the war effort. Thousands of black men enlist in the Union Army, fighting not just for country, but for freedom itself. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers will serve the Union cause. And there is something even bigger at stake. The world is watching. Britain and France, both considering recognizing the Confederacy, now hesitate. They cannot publicly support a nation fighting for slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation turns the tide, not just in America, but across the world. But even as Lincoln reshapes the war, the fighting only grows bloodier. The Union Army still struggles. Defeats mount, public support wavers, and Lincoln faces enemies not just in the South, but within his own government. Radical Republicans criticize him for not going far enough. Northern Democrats, called Copperheads, attack him for going too far. Some demand peace with the Confederacy. Others insist on total war. The pressure is unbearable. But Lincoln does not back down. He believes in the cause now more than ever. And he knows that, no matter the cost, the Union must see this through. Because now there is no turning back. The Union will fight, not just for victory, but for a new birth of freedom. 1863. The war rages on. The Emancipation Proclamation has transformed the conflict, turning it into a war for freedom. But Lincoln knows that words alone will not end the bloodshed. Only victory will. And victory is still out of reach. The Union has suffered disastrous defeats. In Fredericksburg, Union soldiers charge up a hill into a wall of Confederate fire. Thousands are cut down. In Chancellorsville, the brilliant Robert E. Lee, outnumbered 2-1, outmaneuvers the Union Army and delivers another crushing blow. Lincoln is devastated. He cannot afford another failure. And then, in the summer of 1863, everything changes. July 1st, 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Robert E. Lee makes a bold move. He marches north into Union territory. His goal, to break the North's will to fight, to force Lincoln to surrender. If he succeeds, the war may be over. For 3 days, the two armies collide. Over 165,000 men clash in the largest battle ever fought in North America. The fighting is brutal. The fields turn red. The hills shake with cannon fire. Smoke fills the sky. On July 3rd, Lee makes his final gamble, Pickett's charge. 12,500 Confederate soldiers march across an open field toward the Union lines. They are slaughtered. The charge fails. The Confederate army is broken. Lee is forced to retreat. The South will never again invade the North. Lincoln receives the news, a great victory. But he is not satisfied. Lee has escaped. The war is not over. 4 months later, Lincoln stands on the battlefield. Graves stretch as far as the eye can see. He speaks for just 2 minutes. 77 years ago. The Gettysburg Address is short, but in those few moments, Lincoln defines the war itself. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. It is not just about saving the Union anymore. It is about redefining America. Lincoln knows what must be done. The Confederacy must be crushed. He finds his answer in Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike the cautious generals before him, Grant is ruthless, relentless, unstoppable. He does not retreat. He does not hesitate. He fights to win. As Grant wages war in the East, General William Tecumseh Sherman unleashes total war in the South. His infamous March to the Sea begins. Sherman's army burns everything in its path: farms, railroads, entire towns. Atlanta falls, Savannah falls. The South is bleeding out. By early 1865, the Confederacy is collapsing. Lee's army is surrounded. Richmond, the Confederate capital, is burning. The end is near. On April 9th, 1865, in a small farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee surrenders. The war is over. The Union is saved. Lincoln has done it, but even in victory, he does not celebrate. He knows the wounds of war will not heal easily. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He declares in his second inaugural address, he does not want vengeance. He wants healing. He dreams of a nation reunited, stronger than ever. But Abraham Lincoln will not live to see that dream come true. April 14th, 1865. The war is over. Washington, D.C. is alive with celebration. The streets are filled with people rejoicing. The Union has triumphed. Abraham Lincoln, exhausted but hopeful, allows himself a rare moment of peace. That evening, he and Mary Todd Lincoln attend a play at Ford's Theatre. But in the shadows, a deadly conspiracy is unfolding. John Wilkes Booth, actor, Confederate sympathizer, and a man consumed by rage, has been plotting Lincoln's murder for months. Booth sees Lincoln not as a hero but as a tyrant who destroyed the South. He is not alone. a network of conspirators has devised a plan to cripple the Union government in one night. Their targets: President Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. If all three are eliminated, the Confederate cause may rise again. Booth assigns his men. Lewis Powell will attack Seward. George Atzerodt will assassinate Johnson, and Booth himself will take out Lincoln. At 10:15 p.m., as Lincoln laughs at a joke from the play, Booth slips into his private box. He raises a pistol, a .44 caliber Derringer. A single shot shatters the night. Lincoln slumps forward. Mary screams. Booth leaps from the balcony, landing on the stage. He brandishes a knife and shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus, always to tyrants. Then, he vanishes into the darkness. At the same time, Powell forces his way into William Seward's home, slashing him with a knife as he fights for his life. Miraculously, Seward survives. Meanwhile, Atzerodt loses his nerve. He never attacks Johnson. The conspiracy has failed, but the damage is done. Lincoln has been struck down. He is carried across the street to a boarding house. His breathing slows, his pulse weakens. The most powerful man in America now lies in a simple bed, barely clinging to life. Cabinet members gather. Generals stand in silence. His wife weeps at his side. There is nothing they can do. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln draws his final breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton closes his eyes and whispers, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation is paralyzed with grief. Millions mourn. His body is placed on a funeral train traveling from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. The journey takes 2 weeks, passing through cities draped in black, past crowds of mourners stretching for miles. People weep in the streets. Freed slaves kneel as his coffin passes, whispering prayers for the man who gave them freedom. But Lincoln's work is unfinished. Reconstruction begins, but without him. His vision of unity is lost. Radical Republicans demand punishment. The South resists change. The scars of war remain. The country moves forward, but the wounds of war will take generations to heal. More than a century and a half later, his words still echo. His name is spoken in reverence. And across the world, he is remembered not just as a president, but as a symbol. A reminder that even in the darkest times, one man's resolve can change the course of history. Abraham Lincoln's story did not end in that dimly lit room on April 15, 1865. His vision, his struggle, and his sacrifice echo through the very foundation of the nation he fought to preserve. He was not just a president, he was a turning point in history. He led not with power, but with principle. Not with vengeance, but with resolve. He stood firm when the nation fractured, when war consumed the land, when doubt crept into every corner of America's soul. He held the line when no one else could. He freed millions, but knew freedom was only the beginning. He saved the Union, but knew unity had to be rebuilt. He won the war, but did not live to see the peace. And in the end, it was not the bullets of battle that took his life, but the hate of a divided nation. Yet Lincoln's legacy was not written in blood, nor carved in stone. It was carried forward by those who believed in what he stood for. His words, his actions, his sacrifices, they did not die with him. They became part of America itself. And so, the question remains, not just in history books, but in the world we live in today. Do we honor Lincoln's vision? Do we uphold the unity, the freedom, the democracy he fought for? Or do we let the divisions rise again? That answer is up to us.